It's a man's world, apparently, on Seigaiden episode 37.
Would you say I have a plethora of piñatas?
A what?
A plethora.
The Master System sees another revised release of an arcade port that had previously appeared on SG-1000. It's the Ninja. Yes, this is the same game as Ninja Princess, except with 100% less irritating scrolling and 100% less women's lib. Originally released in arcades as Sega Ninja in March 1985 before showing up in its SG-1000 form, the Ninja appears on Master System with new content, a new name, and a new protagonist. A glacial text scroll opens the game to outline the revised backstory, which involves many of the same concepts as Ninja Princess, namely the betrayal of the daimyo by the treacherous Gyokuro. But it changes up roles a bit. Here, Princess Kurumi doesn't slip away from the castle to fight through Gyokuro's hordes on her own. Nope, operating in standard 8-bit mode, this time around she's kidnapped before she can make her way out of the compound. Meaning the player instead controls the loyal warrior Kazamaru, who fights his way through the same challenges that Kurumi had previously tackled in order to stop Gyokuro himself and save the princess. Kazamaru has a much easier time of it than Kurumi did on SG-1000, because the Master System's graphics chip actually supports smooth per-pixel scrolling. Like Ninja Princess, the Ninja plays as a vertically scrolling shooter that doesn't limit its forward movement by ratcheting. You can actually scroll backward, which comes in handy when confronted by massive mobs of wild boars or relentless bosses. Where the SG-1000's graphical limitations forced Ninja Princess to scroll forward in half-screen increments that made for a very choppy experience and left the player vulnerable to sudden ambushes that the screen movement obscured, the Ninja moves forward steadily and speedily. Otherwise, it plays more or less the same as Ninja Princess. Kazamaru dashes around in all directions, tossing daggers and shuriken to fend off waves of attackers as he advances through the fields and villages to reach Okami Castle. Depending on which attack button you use, you can toss weapons straight ahead or in 8 different directions. The fixed upward attacks allow you to focus on evasion and footwork, but leave you vulnerable to attacks from behind, while the all-direction attacks are versatile but force you to face and move in the direction you want to attack, which makes them dangerous in close quarters. You can also hit both buttons at once to activate Ninja Magic that causes you to disappear, granting you about 2 seconds of invulnerability and allowing you to slip out of imminent danger. Now, this is the 4th vertical shooter we've already seen on Master System by the console's 3rd month on the market, which is practically getting to the point of overkill. Heck, with Rambo, it's the 2nd Commando-style shooter released in December. I'd give the Ninja the advantage over all the others though. It's fast-paced, challenging without being unfair, and it comes remarkably close to recreating the arcade original. This release restores content missing from Ninja Princess. The 3 special interstitial stages that mix up the core action to break away from pure vertical shooting. I don't love all of these stages. First in particular, which involves auto-scrolling to the left while dodging boulders that bound diagonally across the screen and enemy ninja that pop up in the same couple of spots, feels needlessly memorization-based. The later stages work better, especially the log ride through the river rapids, which slows down the enemy attack patterns enough that you have time and space to maneuver on the precarious footing without things becoming unreasonably punishing. The race through a stampede of horses seems a little superfluous, but the wall ascent in which you scale the exterior of the castle does a more convincing job with the concept than something like The Legend of Kage or The Amazing Spider-Man. And as in the arcade and SG-1000 games, the Ninja incorporates a scroll-based power-up system. That is, parchment scrolls, not screen scrolls. I can see where that might be confusing. Acquiring a red scroll will enhance Kazamaru's power, exchanging his tiny daggers for larger throwing stars. The shuriken don't have any advantage over knives in terms of raw physical strength, since all enemies besides bosses go down in a single shot. But they do have 2 benefits. Because they're larger, they can more easily block enemy projectiles. And they also have the ability to pierce defeated enemies and take out multiple foes in a single shot. Besides its obvious benefits, that latter trait comes in especially handy if you want to try for a higher hit ratio to boost your score. You can also collect blue scrolls, which boost your speed and make this a much snappier, more pleasant action game than Rambo. The Master System release adds a new type of scroll to the mix, green scrolls. Rather than carrying forward the arcade game's random item drops, which simply awarded the player points, you can only acquire the green scrolls as your single, non-power-up item in the Ninja. These seemingly do nothing for you at first glance, but they do appear as a cumulative total on your status screen at the end of each stage. Just about every stage has a scroll, and the scrolls become increasingly difficult to locate the further you advance into the game. Once you find all of them, a task that often involves going well out of your way or performing seamlessly useless tasks like taking a dead end and shooting at a random object, the point of the green scrolls becomes clear. They reveal the path to the final stage. By following the instructions laid down in the scrolls in the game's 10th stage, you reveal a hidden passage that takes you to the final boss. Otherwise, the game appears to loop until you can figure out where to find the missing scrolls. Considering that this is a fast, difficult game that only gives you 3 lives, and the US version strips out the hidden continue code contained in the Mark III version of the cartridge, you really want to collect all those scrolls in your first go. Thankfully, the Ninja differs from many manual scrolling vertical shooters in that enemies don't appear in endless, respawning waves. Once you clear formations of enemy ninja and samurai, you can take time to poke around the area and look for secrets. The Ninja does lack somewhat for variety outside of the novelty stages, with only half a dozen standard enemy types and 2 boss types that demonstrate only moderate variations and all behave more or less the same way. And the game does lose some of the arcade version's charm, moving away from the more pastel graphics and dropping the interstitial character portraits designed by Rieko Kodama. But it still looks good and plays smoothly despite its zippy pace. It offers a great point of direct comparison versus the SG-1000's Ninja Princess, released about half a year earlier, that showcases just how much of an upgrade the Master System represented from its predecessor. Here at the end of 1986, I'd have to call the Ninja the strongest vertical shooter yet seen on an American home console. A game that requires real effort and persistence from players without being mean about it. Dunking on bad American box art from the 1980s and 1990s is some of the lowest hanging fruit imaginable. And yet, every once in a while, a game package comes along that does such a grave disservice to the content within that you just can't help but stop and gawk. On that note, here's Pro Wrestling for Sega Master System. There's an unfortunate irony about the laughable American packaging in that the Mark III version of Pro Wrestling bore the name and likeness of one of Japan's most recognizable wrestling personalities of the 1980s, Kaoru "Dump" Matsumoto. With her vibrant face paint, bleached mohawk hairstyle, and powerful, stocky build, Matsumoto played a big part in elevating All Japan Women's Pro Wrestling into a popular media force, often playing the heel against her rivals, the Crush Gal team. The mediagenic Matsumoto became a common sight in Japanese pop culture, sometimes lending an authorized likeness to cartoons and games, and sometimes simply appearing as an homage. The anime Megazone 23 apparently just swiped her look for a character named, blatantly enough, Dump, whereas Sega had the decency to pay her for her endorsement. Sega's Gokuwako Dome Dump Matsumoto, which took its name from Matsumoto's construction-themed wrestling team, which also included Crane and Bull, as in bulldozer, debuted in arcades in May 1986 and showed up in the West soon after, minus Matsumoto, as Body Slam. The Mark III version shipped almost immediately afterwards and retained both Matsumoto's endorsement and the arcade game's general gameplay, though of course it suffered from something of a visual downgrade in the move from System 16 hardware to the home console. So why, may you ask, did the Master System version show up under the tragically generic name Pro Wrestling rather than Body Slam as in arcades? Because as with the Ninja, we have a female-led arcade game that became a boys-only affair on Master System. Body Slam retained the women's wrestling style of the Japanese release for the West, but Pro Wrestling redraws all the sprites as men. I don't think these two games speak to any particular agenda on Sega's part beyond paying fealty to marketing research that said the boys who constituted the Master System's primary audience couldn't possibly empathize with or relate to girls, even when said girl is a 200-pound ball of muscle capable of pile-driving you through a table. It's simply an odd coincidence that two Sega games underwent gender reassignment here in December 1986. Anyway, only the game's character sprites changed in localization. Pro Wrestling plays just like its Mark III counterpart, which thankfully means it plays a whole lot better than Champion Pro Wrestling for SG-1000. Sega had two strains of pro wrestling heritage to choose from when designing the game that became pro wrestling. The aforementioned Champion Pro Wrestling, which we saw on SG-1000, and the oddly named Apo, a 1984 arcade game developed by Sanritsu. Pro wrestling works a whole lot more like Apo, which means you simply control your little guys directly as they grapple in the ring, rather than relying on menu-based commands. At a basic level, the controller's face buttons let you punch and kick, though the game assigns a lot of contextual functions to account for the console's minimal interface. Those same two buttons will also cause you to pin a foe, perform special moves, tag in your partner, climb a turnbuckle, or launch yourself off the ropes, depending on the current situation inside the ring and the direction you happen to be pressing on the D-pad. Each wrestler has a limited stamina bar that determines their vulnerability. As you take a beating, your stamina drops, causing you to perform less effectively and eventually leaving you open to a pin by your opponent if they manage to drop you. Pro Wrestling for Master System doesn't emphasize grappling to the degree seen in its NES counterpart, Tri and Nintendo's Pro Wrestling, which would ship a few months after Sega's release. Rather, it has more the feel of a brawler a la Renegade, in that you punch and kick an opponent a few times to knock them down so that you can abuse them while they lay helpless. And a key strategy here involves tapping out to send in your partner and allow your stamina to regenerate in the background. You can also scramble outside of the ring, where you have 20 seconds to grapple or attempt to smash your opponent with a chair before you're disqualified with a ring out. The commands take a lot of practice to pull off effectively, and it can be pretty frustrating to try to tag in your partner only to perform a completely different action that leaves your weakened wrestler vulnerable and costs you the match. Pro Wrestling offers your pick of 4 two-person teams: the Mad Soldiers, the Great Marksmen, the Orient Express, and the Crush Brothers. With their vivid pastel face paint, the Mad Soldiers map directly onto Dump herself, along with her teammate Crane Yu, while the Great Maskmen began life as the second half of the Gokuaku team, Bull Nakano and Condor Saito. Meanwhile, the Orient Express and Crush Brothers take the place of two pairs called Fresh Gals, which I have to assume were thinly veiled versions of the Crush Gals, a reference made fairly explicit by the Crush Brothers, who reclaim a part of that name while also making a nod to American favorite Hulk Hogan with their yellow outfits, blonde mustaches, and, of course, the word brothers. With his emphasis on teams rather than individuals, Master System's Pro Wrestling lacks the memorable characters of the NES game, like Starman and the Amazon, but it makes up for it with the tag team element and a fun sense of personality, like the way each team makes its entrance to theme music. I'd place this release a step below the NES Pro Wrestling, but it sure beats that console's other wrestling offers for 1986, Data East's Tag Team Wrestling and Bandai's Muscle, both of which were pretty dire. The US version's detachment from real-world Japanese wrestling superstars was unfortunate but understandable, and Sega's home team did a pretty good job of redrawing the wrestlers here as obvious analogs to WWF stars like Hogan, Andre the Giant, and the Road Warrior, who were the American Ninja Warrior to Dump Matsumoto's Takeshi's Castle. With its thinly veiled analogs and crisp gameplay, Pro Wrestling for Master System offered a compelling reason to skip Nintendo's console and pledge fealty to Sega for 80s kids who loved watching WWF on television every weekend. Next time on Segaiden, all I need is a miracle world.